welcome to Stork'd, the podcast, in which we explore the many ways to build and define family. This is your host, Julia, and today I'm so excited to introduce to you Louise McLoughlin. Louise is a journalist. She writes a lot about donor conception and actually has a podcast about donor conception called You Look Like Me, which is absolutely brilliantly done, and I highly recommend it. What's interesting about this podcast is that she uses it to explore her own donor-conceived identity by talking to a lot of other donor-conceived individuals. And along the way, she actually identifies and finds her sister and her biological father. And it's all recorded. It's really incredible. And you're going to hear us talk about her story. And you're going to hear us also talk about the themes and trends she's heard from the donor-conceived population. This is really interesting because in the zeitgeist about fertility and fertility journeys, we talk a lot about the parents who are going through an infertility journey. And we talk about the experience of using donor sperm like I did, or donor eggs or donor embryos. But we don't often get the perspective of the donor-conceived individual. You've heard me say it before, and I'll say it now, that we live in this really interesting intersection in our family building lives between science and the evolution of technology, and the way in which our culture is changing to normalize different types of families. So let's go back a couple decades as sperm donors and egg donors were just becoming scientifically available. At that time, it was incredibly taboo to use donor conception in your family creation journey. It was also considered to be anonymous. Now, however, we have databases and the ability to identify one another's DNA so that anonymity has gone away. And now we have a community of individuals in their 20s and 30s who are discovering that they were donor conceived. And they're finding out that after all these years of being raised in a family, assuming their parent was their biological parent, that is not actually the case. Wow. Can you imagine that? Louise talks to a number of these people and shares with us this donor conceived perspective. And it is really tremendous. I highly recommend you listen not only to this episode, but to her podcast. Season 1 is just mind-blowing. If you like what you hear, and I'm sure that you will, please don't forget to share it with a friend, give a great review anywhere that you listen to podcasts, and don't forget to sign up for our newsletter. We have a wonderful newsletter, or so I think. Here's Louise. I hope you enjoy. Welcome, Louise, to Stork'd, the podcast, in which we explore the many ways to build and define family. I am so excited to have you here to talk about all things donor conception, specifically the experience of being a donor-conceived individual. As you and the audience knows, I am raising a donor-conceived individual, so I've got a million questions for you. But before we dive in, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, so I'm a journalist. I work over in London, and I'm also donor conceived. I found out age 13. And it was, one of those crazy moments where I had no idea that donor conception was a thing until I suddenly realized that it was, and it was happening to me. So, it's been kind of a really big journey since then. And there's been different stages through the years of kind of coming to terms with it and then deciding maybe I wanted to find some answers. And then as those answers came in, kind of drip fed over the years, as obviously, DNA testing became more of a thing. More people sign up to it. And then it got to the stage where I decided to start writing about it as well, kind of bringing my personal experience and my profession together. And I wrote an article about my own experience, and then I started covering other people's stories. And that kind of led to the podcast that I host, which is called You Look Like Me. And that podcast is kind of following along my own story alongside experiences of donor conceived people all over the world. And it's one of those things, you think you know the story, you think you know the experiences and the themes that people go through. And then you realize, oh my God, there are so many different stories, issues, experiences. It was meant to be like a 5-episode series. And sometimes I'm like pitching ahead, looking ahead. I'm like, this could go on forever. So it's just been kind of telling my own story, coming to terms with something that was kind of originally a bit of a secret, and now kind of trying to wear that badge proudly and trying to elevate those other donor conceived voices as well.
Yeah, I love that you sit in sort of this matrix, in the center of this matrix of all these different voices. And to talk about amplifying them and the self-discovery, what I said before we even started recording was that I thought I knew just a little bit. And the more I learn, the less I know, which is, to be honest, the same experience I'm having professionally and with parenting, with anything, right? The world opens up, and as it opens up, it becomes so apparent that it's so complicated. So I'm excited to talk to you about a couple things. I do want to hear your story for our listeners because I think that would be really beneficial. And I want to hear some of the trends and themes that you're seeing in the donor conceived community, because as far as I can tell, there's like two different factions, and we can dive into that a little bit. So let's start with you. 13 is a very pivotal age for self-discovery, regardless of your genetic composition and how you came to be in your family. Tell us about how you discovered that you were donor conceived.
The revelation. Yeah.
The revelation.
So my parents used a sperm donor, and they used it back when it was, I think I was kind of conceived 13 years after the very first IVF baby. So it was new. It wasn't really spoken about. As I'm sure you and your listeners know, there's a lot of kind of issues tied into fertility. And I think it was just a difficult time to kind of be using IVF, to be using donors. And my parents were told never to tell me, because you could get away with it back then. We had no idea DNA testing was like going to explode. And what my parents actually did, which was common, I'm not really sure when this fell out of vogue, but it was a thing called sperm mixing. So when my parents used a donor, they also used sperm from my dad. And it's so, just for clarity, by the way, as we go through, when I refer to my dad, I'm speaking of the man who raised me in the kind of parental family unit. So from a donor, they used from my dad. And I think it was just that kind of plausible deniability. So maybe that fed into you don't need to tell because he might be the dad, we don't know. But for whatever reason, they decided to tell me, and I'm really, really glad they did. I mean, that now these days is the guidance. It is that you do tell the truth. Why they decided at 13, and I'm not entirely sure. I think they decided that I was old enough to understand it. But exactly as you said, you are really learning who you are, but I think you've just started building that sense of self. So maybe I had laid down this foundation of who I was, and obviously all that I did know was that my family unit was me, mum, dad. And then when they told me, it just kind of exploded, all of that. And it was just such a weird situation of that sperm mixing kind of threw everything into question even more. So I didn't even no one in that room actually knew what the truth was, right? But they were telling me he might not be your dad.
Oh, that's interesting, because I think of sperm mixing as almost like a psychological trick so that the male partner can feel a sense of biological connection, even if there might not be. The plausible deniability, as you talked about. So it seems like it's more for him than it is for you.
Exactly. And it actually just made it a lot more confusing. But it was so strange because I remember her mum kind of was the mediator in a way. And I think just because it affected me and dad so much, I think maybe she thought she was kind of the more neutral voice to be kind of talking through what was happening. And I remember she said, I could see where the conversation was going. And I said, so are you telling me dad's not my dad? And she said, no, he is. And I went, oh my God, thank God. I thought that conversation was going a different way. And she just went, but maybe not in that way. And I just it's that stomach sinking feeling. And just, I feel like my brain was fizzing, it was just everything, almost if it had been a movie and the scene starts to disintegrate. That's almost how it felt.
It sounds like she was able in her head to distinguish between parenting, as you called the person who raised you, and the biology of the creating you, but that you weren't yet able to see that distinction, if there is a distinction.
I think it was just so much at once.
Yeah.
And I just adore my dad. And it was that moment of, oh my God, but I don't want that bond that we have, that biological bond, to be taken away. But it was one of those things. It was obviously a very upsetting conversation for everyone. It was a lot for me to take in. My dad got emotional, which is something that, it's not a personality trait that I've seen much from him over the years. And I remember kind of leaving that conversation and going, oh my God, that really upset everyone. And it's me. It was about me. So I don't know if I want to bring this up again, because I'll just upset everyone again, And maybe because of that weird, is he not question, I just kind of sat on it for 2 years, and I probably should have been more vocal about it. But again, you're a teenager, there's a lot of stuff going on in your head. And I think I just kept it in. And then I told my boyfriend at the time when I was 15, and he was like, oh my God. I was like, do you not want to know either way? And I was like, oh my God, I really do want to know. But I hadn't spoken about it for so long that I'd actually got to the point where I was like, have I made this up? Like, is this even a thing? And saying it out loud to him was just so validating. And I was like, yeah, I do want to know. And I wanted to know because there was still that glimmer of hope that, if we get that DNA test and it comes back and he is my dad after all, that's going to be great. Like 2 years of kind of pressure that we could have done without, but it would be great news. So we did that DNA test, and actually don't even know how my parents found it. It was like well before the kind of commercial DNA test. It was like a proper company with the pages came back and it was just jargon. And then this last sentence on the last page just said, from the analysis of person A versus person B, we do not believe that they are related. And that was just that moment all over again of, that sinking feeling, because I don't think dad wanted to know, I think he was happy not knowing. And I kind of felt like I had been the one to like barrel through and make this decision that had now been quite upsetting to everyone yet again. So I just stopped talking about it again.
Yeah. What was his reaction when you said, it is important for me to find out?
I think he understood. I think it's always a difficult conversation, but I think he knew that it was coming from a place of curiosity as opposed to, oh, there's another man out there who is actually my dad and I want to find him. Like, it was definitely not that. It was just, this is about me and I want to know either way. Yeah. So they were always very supportive of that.
So I'm curious, you talk about donor conception and you've shared your story on podcasts, in interviews like this one, on your own podcast and your own writing. And yet I'm looking at you and I can see that this is still a very emotional and raw experience for you. Tell us about the feeling of discovering that this person that you love so much was not biologically related to you.
I think a lot of it, and the reason the guidance now is that donor conceived people deserve to know, is because, as I said, dad's dad, he's the one who, when I tripped and fell as a kid, he was the one who scooped me up, and he was the one who put up with the tantrums and was the one there to hug me at the end of the day. It was more the shock of it. And it was more because I'm an only child. It was more going, oh my God, you guys knew this and didn't tell me, and I'm 13 and this has been kept from me. And it was, this is a universal experience, by the way, for donor conceived people who find out later in life. It's that rug pull from under them moment. And it's that kind of, oh my God, I've been deceived moment. That's what stings and confuses more, I think. And then it was just this opening of so many questions for me. It was like, when I found out, okay, you're not my biological father, who the hell is? And it was before, so I know like over in the States, there's no legislation whatsoever, but that legislation has been brought in the UK kind of in small drips. And none of that existed when I was conceived. It came in a few months after I was born. So I had no medical records or anything. The same as everyone would have in the US right now. Like there's no route to go down. There's nothing kept, no health records, no physical descriptions even. So it was basically like, well, if you want to find out, you're on your own. You've got, and again, this was before DNA testing. So my only way was to go back to the clinic and be like, do you have any records? And they went, no, we don't. And that was it. I was like, right, well, next step.
Oh, that's so hard because, there's technical reasons why you might want that information. If you're experiencing something going on with your health, knowing if a family member has similarly had that is useful for you and your doctor. But there's an emotional component.
100%. But yeah, I've interviewed donor conceived people who have genetic medical conditions that, had they known about earlier, they could have begun to treat or treated more effectively or diagnosed more effectively. And they are now stuck in a situation where their lack of health history has really damaged their health. Like, obviously, if something's genetic, you'll get it anyway, if that's the way it's going to happen. But they have been deprived getting on that sooner or treating it sooner. And there was actually a law change in Australia because a woman died of bowel cancer, I believe. And she could have had that record earlier. And she actually identified her biological father. And the really sad thing was he was so happy to have met her. And he was like, had I been given that opportunity, I would have stepped forward earlier. I would have loved for her to have had that medical history. So I think it's important to put things in place for people now that the law has changed in the UK, so you can identify who that donor is. It's just making sure that it's applied to past cases as well, and people know that they can kind of put that information out there if they want.
Yeah. What's really interesting talking to you from somebody who sits in the US, where the legislature is so far behind that of the UK with regards to donor conception, and that the global community is really trying to figure out how to support this new world as technology advances, as legislation advances, as we learn more. And you get to learn about all of this through your research, through your work, through your podcast. If you were to write the laws, what might you create on behalf of the donor conceived community?
I think that anonymous donation is something that the community pretty much unanimously agrees should not be happening. But I will always say you should tell your child the truth from day one. And obviously, sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's a single mom, sometimes it's a gay couple. But when it's kind of a, traditional family, something that's perceived as more traditional, it's easier to hide it. So there's conversations around, well, do we put it on birth certificates, or how do we police that to make sure that parents are telling their kids that they're donor conceived? And there's many reasons why you would do that. Yes, it's to give them the right to maybe track down a biological parent or their biological half siblings, but it's also a health thing. And it's also, when donation is happening, donors donate kind of a few times over the course of a few years. So the kids and then the people that they create end up generally living in the same area and being the same age. And if you don't know you're donor conceived, that's quite a dangerous position to be put in, because you could be hanging out with people who are actually your half siblings, and it could go further than that. And I think not providing your child with information that could protect them from something like that is really, really dangerous. So my opinion would be honesty from day one and no anonymity for donors. And that's something that I have learned, has been said to me by many members of this community as well.
It's a theme that I've heard as well. And in fact, I think I started by saying, I've just started the conversation. I'm 11 months into being a parent of a donor conceived person, and my podcast is 2 years old. So my conversations are just at the very beginning of what is possible. And you are so far ahead in the conversations here. And yet all the conversations I've had echo exactly that sentiment. The knowledge is power in so many cases. It's empowerment, both from a health perspective, from a psychological wellness and identity perspective, and from an agency perspective in making life choices like who my partner is.
Yeah, 100%. And also, I really respect that you've got me on this podcast having this conversation. And I think what you were saying about, the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. And it's so important to put donor conceived voices to let us have a seat at the table because of the information that we can bring. And what I always try to say is, I just said, I don't believe donors should be anonymous. I think you should tell your child from day one. But that's not coming from a place of shaming. And I don't want anyone who's listening to go, oh my God, I haven't told my child from day one. I'm the worst XYZ. It's not a shaming process. It's an educational process. And exactly what you said, like information is power. And just because someone made an analogy a while ago and they were like, it's like not putting seatbelts on kids in cars. We're not calling you stupid just because you didn't do it, but we're just saying now that we know that they should wear a seatbelt, put a seatbelt on them. It's not the end of the world that you didn't tell your kid from day one, but now you have power and the knowledge to know that it is actually in their best interest. And that's coming from studies, and that's coming from the stories of donor conceived people.
I really love that seatbelt analogy. It's really special. I understand that you've discovered members of your biological family, including a sister and your biological father. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So I had already found my half sister a few years previous. And I think I had decided, once I realized that my dad who raised me wasn't my biological father, that I wanted to put myself out there. And when these, DNA testing sites started popping up, I was like, I will use them to my advantage. And again, that was a curiosity thing. It wasn't that I was looking for another parent. It was just, I have so many questions, and I just want to know where these personality traits and these hobbies that I have that I know haven't come from either parent, I want to see if there's something that's come from that donor. So that was kind of the reason that I was on the sites. And then nothing happened for so many years that I started going, it is really unlikely that this guy is going to put his own DNA up. You know, I don't know how many times he's donated. He doesn't want 50 kids rolling in. He thought he'd be anonymous. I don't think this is going to work. So I went to like a meetup of donor conceived people in London just after I moved here. And a lot of them were talking about wanting to find half siblings. And having grown up as an only child, it was something that had never, ever, ever occurred to me. And I went, oh my God, I didn't even think that was an option. It didn't, I don't know why, it just never crossed my mind. And I could see the enthusiasm that they had about the concept. And I started thinking about it more. And I was like, firstly, there's more of them. It's not like there's one donor, like there could be a wealth of siblings out there. And secondly, they're in my position and they'd probably sign up for the same reasons as me. So I kind of switched my, like, not that I had any control over it, but I kind of switched my goal to, oh, maybe I'll have some siblings. And kind of maybe a year and a half after I signed up to these sites, I matched with my half sister, and it was incredible. And it answered all of those questions really that I had just said. Where did this hobby come from? Where did this, expression I make come from? Where did my nose come from? And that to me, I wrote an article about it, and I said, the article ended with the words, I'm not looking for my biological dad anymore because my sister is enough. And then of course, once you let go of something, life rolls on. Around 2 years ago, we got a match with someone, and it was actually while I was recording the podcast. Again, the podcast was meant to be other people's stories held up with my voice kind of stringing everything together and just kind of an underlying story that made the listener come back. And then somehow this link, this DNA link just popped up, and his cousin in Canada had signed up. And I just realized that this was close enough for me to be able to find him. And yeah, we found him kind of the next morning. Jess hadn't really been that enthusiastic about it. She's brought up by two mums, and she, has never really kind of yearned for a father figure as such. So she was like, you go, you look, if he pops up, he pops up, but I don't know how I feel about a relationship or anything. And then the second I was like, we have a lead, she was like, all right, Facebook open, we are stalking, like
it changes everything. Yeah.
We went down the rabbit hole, and within hours we found this guy who looked like me and Jess, my half sister, and he had a website for his dance classes that he does, and there was a phone number there. And Jess was kind of like, okay, great. So we'll take a deep breath. We'll write a letter. We'll send it in the post. And I was like, no, we are calling him right now. And she was like, you're absolutely insane. I was like, yes, I am. So I put on my journalist hat, and I was like, I cold call people all the time. I'll just treat it the same way. And I call him and he doesn't reply, and it goes to voicemail. I'm like, oh my God, what am I doing? And then he texts me and he's like, hi, do I know you? And he's very open as a person, but also on social media. So I could immediately tell what his hobbies were. He kind of talked about having done drama when he was younger, and he owned a motorbike. I used to love drama. I love motorbikes. So I kind of opened with things that would tie us together emotionally, and make it clear that I'm a person reaching out as opposed to just a number on WhatsApp. So I said, I'm a journalist. I live in London, donor conceived. I love drama. I love motorbikes. And he obviously got it straight away. And he was like, and what can I help you with? And that line, when you read it through text, I was like, this is going to be a rejection, because it was so, so level and so not emotional. It was just, what do you think I can help you with?
It sounds so British, right? Which is like when I interact with my British friends, it's so hard to tell. Is it sarcasm? Are you making fun of me? Is there deep emotion here, or is it neutral?
Especially
right?
Over text. Yeah,
exactly.
Especially with a stranger.
Exactly.
So I went, oh my God. And I just said, I have a DNA match on a website, and I think it leads me to you, and I think we might have a biological connection. Does that make sense to you? And then he called me. And I had Jess kind of texting me through this, and I was going, oh my God, he's just called. And I just recorded it, because I thought, if this is the only time, if he's about to reject me, this is the only time I'll ever speak to him, and Jess will never hear his voice, And that conversation was just so incredibly pure. And he was so open and so, he said, I'm so impressed you found me. I obviously need to digest this, but let's go at our own pace. But I would love to learn more about you. And then around 20 minutes into the conversation, he asked, is there one of you or is there more? And I said, yeah, there's another. She's Jess. She's an ecologist. She's very into like the environment. And his voice just cracks. And that's kind of the first time I realized that it was obviously a huge moment for him, but I realized that this is crashing down on him now, but in a really like, he's feeling this moment and there's love behind it, but he later gave me permission to use that phone call on the podcast, which is amazing. So that's episode 4. And I would encourage people who want to hear it to listen because that moment, especially, but it is just so funny because I swing between, oh my God, this question that I've had in my head since age 13, I've been looking for this man or some connection to this man for more than half my life at this point. And now I'm talking to him. So trying to process that and also just asking very journalistic questions and still journalist hat on. And it's just, it's maybe the Britishness that you just said, but it's funny. But so we've met each other probably more than 10 times, I reckon, at this point. I've met him one-on-one, I've met him with Jess. And it's just, it's a lovely relationship. It's always changing. And I described him as a fun uncle the other day in an interview.
I like that.
And I'm not sure I'm not sure he loved it.
Oh.
But I would characterize it that way because, I've since kind of explained it, and I'm sure I had said it to him before and face to face as well. But I see such resemblance, and sometimes, but it's not, he'll make fun of me in a way that a parent would not. And I'd kind of probably tell him about the stupid things I've done, whereas I would, not tell my parents sometimes. I'd pretend to be more of a golden child. But like I said, it's definitely that comparison is definitely not spot on, and it is always changing, but it's been really interesting. And, as I say, thank God he has been so open to all of it and not rejected, as you just said, is obviously a concern. And I think that's why I would encourage known donation, is because if a donor knows that they'll be found, right, they're kind of waiting for that moment and they've accepted it. But obviously, if it's an anonymous donor and your child did then make the decision that they wanted to track them down, the potential for rejection, unfortunately, is very high.
I will say that somebody told me in a different conversation that was not recorded that donor conception is so unfair because it's somebody who is participating in becoming a parent with the intention of never parenting, right? By donating your biology, you never intend to be a parent. And so therefore, it's predicated on this inherent rejection from the get-go. And I'm wrestling with that. I can see the perspective.
I mean, it's not something I've heard before, but it resonates when you say it. I guess the thing is, donors have their own reasons for it. And some, back in the day, I think it was definitely more money driven in the US as opposed to here. We don't get compensated in the UK for being donors like you guys would. What I find quite shocking is this, advertising campaign directed at college students a lot of the time, being like, you can make this much $1,000 if you. It's like you're asking like young women, especially because we know there's like a shortage of egg donors, and it's like you're not giving them information. You're not educating them before they make these choices, and I guess it is rejection because they just feel like they're handing something over that they'll never have to think about again. And we know now that's just not the reality.
Yeah. I want to keep centering this on the donor conceived person because, as you mentioned, those voices are not always shared. And for us to continue talking about the donor continues to take away from your story. So let's go back to you and your experiences. There's 2 things that you said that really spark a point of curiosity for me. The first is, it sounds like you have 2 male parents in different ways whom you love and adore and cherish in different ways, right? One is this fun uncle type person. We know that's not a great description, but it sounds like you're still searching for the right one. And the other is the dad who raised you that you love and adore. How has your relationship with your dad changed as a result of discovering your biological father?
I will say that was one of the hardest conversations I ever had to have with him. For this podcast, a lot of the reviews and the feedback has been, wow, you put so much of yourself into this, you followed every moment and you shared it. And, I'm glad I did. I think I made it richer, and it definitely wasn't always like an easy choice. I did feel like I was bearing my soul a lot of times along the way. But I ended up kind of recording everything by the end of it. And the one thing I couldn't record was telling my dad that I had found my donor. But it was the line that I kind of drew for myself that I didn't want to cross. And I mean, I bawled my eyes out when I told it. I sat mum and dad down and I was going, do I just tell dad? Do I tell mum as well? But I just thought, yeah, just do it. But I had this, this moment where I went, do I need to tell them? Can I get away with not telling them? And it was so funny because it's the same house that they sat me down in and told me, age 13. And I was always like, why didn't you tell me sooner? Like, I can't believe you would keep this a secret. And then I was like, maybe I can keep a secret, which is the one thing that I always, value. Like, I wanted that truth. And then here I am, like, wrestling with it myself. But yeah, obviously went ahead and told them. And I just said, dad, like, if anything, it's just reinforced how strongly I feel about you. You are my dad. You raised me. You loved me. You've been there through everything. So in terms of our relationship, I think it's brought more honesty to it. I think it's maybe made me double down more on verbalizing how I feel about our relationship. It's obviously been difficult for both of us, but maybe we need to be more honest with each other about how it's difficult for both of us in our different ways, because it's our shared story. That's the thing. And sometimes I feel a bit selfish doing the podcast because I'm like, I'm only telling one half of the story. It's the half that I think is missing from conversations, which is why I'm doing it. But I am aware that as I remember things and speak about things, they're not just my experience. My parents made very big decisions. There were struggles around fertility there, and IVF is an invasive procedure, as we know. And I think I'm kind of maturing into that more as I do the podcast and as we speak about it. But the great thing about this podcast is we now do talk about it, which wasn't the way. And my mum made the decision after I started speaking out about it. I think I did my articles first. She was kind of like, well, the cat's out of the bag. I guess we have to tell people now. And she hadn't told family. She hadn't told friends. No one knew. They knew that my mum and dad were married for a long time before I came along, but no one knew that this had been the way it was done.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And she was so worried to tell them, and no one cared. No one cared. People thought it was interesting. They were just like, oh, that's very cool. Like, there you go. But no one was like, oh, well, that changes how we feel about Louise, or, oh my God, that like, it was, I think she found it validating. And I think, she turned to me after and she was like, I wish we'd done that sooner. And that was like such a win for me. That was such a, this is the right way to do it, I think.
It's so funny to me because that's one of the great privileges I have as a solo parent, is that, first of all, it's pretty obvious that something happened, right? To everyone, and hopefully including my son down the road. But also, I tell everyone. I can be at the park and meet somebody for the first time that I'm never going to meet again. They're like, oh, how's your husband? I was like, nope, I don't have one. This kiddo's donor conceived. And so I feel like I have these micro moments of validation in my decision every day. Maybe I'm just in a really great community. And yet I know that I have the privilege because I get to own the story right now, and I get to tell it however I want. And I don't have a partner who's got complicated relationships about it. And I'm not a donor conceived person who is discovering their identity in a different way. So there's a different agency, there's a different ownership over the sperm donor relationship when you're a solo parent rather than the person who was conceived this way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's why I think this conversation is great, because it's, two very different perspectives about pretty much the exact same thing. And I think it will be interesting to see, when your son does get a little older, how he feels about it all. But the fact that you just said that you were telling everyone, I did a talk a while ago and one of the girls knew that she was donor conceived from day one. And she made the point, she was just like, I used to tell everyone in the playground that I was made in a petri dish or I was made in a test tube, and they thought it was so cool. And I was like, oh my God, like the first time I heard about it, I was 13 and they were like, it's because it applies to you. Yeah. I would have loved just the thought that donor conceived people can be in talking about that and hearing that and knowing that that's a thing, age 5. And it's just another story, It's just like, we know that the modern family looks completely different now and it's changing all the time. taking so many different forms. And I think that's amazing. And it's just another version of that. And I just think that this conversation moving forward is great. And on every level, for you talking about it and then your kid growing up and knowing, it's just so helpful.
So one of the words that you used when you met your sister relates to how I feel about my son growing up. And I have this deep fear, having spoken to a couple people about their experiences, that he's going to grow up and he's not going to feel worthy. He's not going to feel loved enough. He's going to feel like some half of him is missing because there's this big question mark. And unfortunately, our donor is anonymous. We could talk about whether that person will stay anonymous or not because of technology, but selected to be anonymous when he donated. So theoretically, my son will always have a question mark around one half of his identity. And I have this great fear around the trauma that might cause him. You used a word when you said you found your sister and you wrote it at the last sentence of your first article, and that was, she is enough. The word enough feels really charged, right? It's, am I enough? Is the parents that raised me, are they enough? Is finding my biological connection enough, or do I need to have a specific type of relationship with them? I don't know how to frame this question without it being too esoteric, but can you tell us a little bit about the word enough and your relationship to it with regards to donor conception?
Yeah, no one's ever asked me that before, by the way. I think when I say enough, what I meant is it fulfilled the goal that I had set, which was to answer those questions.
Mm-hmm.
So, had my goal been different, had I gone, oh, I want a relationship out of this, I want a paternal relationship, obviously that statement then wouldn't have held. But for me, being curiosity driven, it was kind of like, yeah, it ticks the boxes of what that search had meant to me.
Yeah. You have your finger on the pulse of what the donor conceived community might be feeling. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the themes that you've heard either on your podcast or from others in the community that might be important for our audience to know?
I think, what I hear about why people look for who that biological connection might be. Again, a lot of the time it is medical history. It's not always. Sometimes it is literally just wanting to identify those parts of themselves that they're like, there's 50% missing, and I want to know where that comes from.
Yeah.
Sometimes they want that half sibling relationship, which has been so rich and fulfilling for me personally. And I know for others, I just think for so many of us, it's just information. And it's a sore spot between, we're often told, well, this person was told that they'd be anonymous. What gives you the right to barge into their life? And, they signed something that said they were guaranteed this. Why do you feel that you're in a position to take it away? And it's just so easy to go, well, obviously 3 parents signed this, or, the medical community was involved, and then the donor, and then the recipient parents. But a person resulted out of this, and they were not part of that contract, but we're as valid in it, if not more so, than everyone else who signed whatever. And I mean, we know anonymity is just not a thing anyway anymore. Yeah, I think people can be really heartless when they hear donor conceived stories sometimes, and they really do veer to take the side of the donor. Yeah, it's just bizarre to me, because if you distill any Disney movie, right, any great story of our time, most of them go back to this need to know who you are, where you come from. That's like literally every Disney movie that we've been growing up on. And it is such a human thing to want to know that. And people forget that.
First of all, that's such a great parallel. I'm like, my mind is blown right now. But I'm also thinking, as you talk about the Disney story, so much of the Disney stories are the hero's journey. You leave the comfort of your home environment. You either conquer something challenging or you discover something new and it changes you, and you come back and you bring that learning to that comfortable community. That's the Joseph Campbell concept. And to some extent, the self-discovery around finding your biological parent is that hero's journey. Let me go out, let me go find my other half. Let me learn about myself and bring that back into the fold. How does that feel?
Yeah, but life as we thought we knew it, bobbing along. There's one moment that throws everything into like chaos.
Yeah.
And then you have to go on this journey and figure out who you are, where you come from. And sometimes that journey is nice and sometimes it's not. Mostly it's a mix of all of it. And then I think the one thing that is different is this journey does not end. There is no, okay, I've found this, I've ticked this box, I'm done. I got a half brother roll in like 3 months ago, and it's just so exhausting, and I will never, because I never not have open arms for someone who is my half sibling, ever, ever, ever. I've been on this journey, Jess and I found each other first. And I now appreciate, now there's three of us. Anyone else who crops up is going to be coming into this larger group. And it's confusing enough as it is. And now we found bio dad Neil. So this new brother found me. I've got my full name on my 23andMe, which is how we matched. He Googles me straight away. He finds the podcast. He finds the descriptions. He realizes that the bio dad has been found. So not only has he just had one match, which is how me and Jess did it, which blew my mind like crazy. And I think I took like 3 days off work to like process it all. Not only has he had that explosion, he's now got another half sister. So he's got two in the space of like an hour, and a bio dad. And my voice just chatting away about it over the course of like how many episodes. Like that to me is just crazy. And we don't know how many half siblings we have. This is the thing as well. So I am going to be getting those emails and those text messages throughout my life, I think.
Yeah.
And that to me is crazy. And, I said when I found Jess, I think I took like a few days off work. When I found my half brother, who I'm not saying his name just because he just doesn't want it out there, which is completely fine as well. I took 1 day off, and I think I got over it more quickly, but it is still an emotional roller coaster. And then this new relationship, and it's like a first date, you're just trying to figure each other out, but you kind of want to keep each other in each other's lives as much as possible. And you want to like them because they're half you, or they're quarter you, or half siblings. And yeah, it's crazy. And to think that that's going to keep happening is really exhausting. Like it's really tiring. And it's just one of those weird things. And I've interviewed people. I interviewed one guy with 200 plus half siblings. And I've interviewed a lot of Americans with 60 plus half siblings. And I don't believe that we should ever have created a situation where people have more half siblings than most people have friends, because no one has 60 friends, not 60 friends that they're in close contact with and see all that time. And to suddenly have that many half siblings, to me, because at that point you have to make the choice of, do I maintain relationships? Do I not? Do I pick and choose? Which I guess is what you'd have to do. But it's a lot of management for people. And it's just very strange to think that we have purposely created that situation.
Yeah, this again is not my story. This is your story. But one of the things that is, and it's my part of this is so complicated because on one hand, this industry, and it is an industry, gave me the greatest joy of my entire life. And I wish that this wasn't a component of the industry. I wish that the number of siblings were in some way limited or restricted. And that sounds so selfish because obviously my son's amazing and everyone should have one of him. Yeah.
But it's not selfish. That it's actually the opposite, because it's in your child's benefit to not have 100 plus siblings running around. This is it.
And it's scary. It's really scary. How do you help a child navigate all that? Or how do you navigate it yourself? Or how do you help a half sibling navigate it? It's the really tough stuff that you're tackling with me now and on your podcast. So I want to wrap up because I want to be sensitive about time. Before I do, is there anything that you think our audience needs to know about the donor-conceived community that we haven't covered? It's so hard to cover everything, and you've spent your life diving into this. So I imagine there's quite a bit that we could have touched on, but anything really stand out to you?
I think at the end of the day, every person is different. And what this comes back to is just relationships, right? So I can talk about my own story, and I can speak to the themes that I've seen, and I can speak to what the community at large and what I believe are the best ways to do this in its honesty as early as possible. And whether that's honesty with a donor who is open to not being anonymous from the get-go, and then honesty as whatever the story is, whatever the truth is, just being age appropriate with that from the get-go. But I don't speak for every single donor conceived person either. And at the end of the day, it's all relationships, and relationships are complicated.
Yeah.
But honesty, no matter what the situation, is generally a good thing. And for our community, I'm a big advocate of it.
So let me ask the question I love to ask at the end of every episode. And that is particularly for you. I mean, you tackle this subject every day, all day, but Based on your personal life lived experience and the podcast and the conversations that you've had, how do you define family?
Do I define a family?
I know. I saved the hard one for last.
Yeah. I think it's the people that show up for you. I don't believe in the traditional notions of family anymore because I think, like I said, the modern family can look really bonkers sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we all have family members who, we can give or take. And we have non-family members who are our family at the core, right? It's so interesting because finding Jess has been, as I said, just so amazing. And I haven't done this episode yet, but one that I really want to do is people who got false matches in our community. So people who signed up for DNA sites before the big commercial ones were out, and they were just done with technology that wasn't quite there yet, or, an algorithm that wasn't correct. And they were matched to people and sometimes thought that they were siblings for years and then found out that they weren't. And I often wonder, because Jess means so much to me and our relationship is amazing, I always wonder, what if I found out she wasn't actually my biological half-sister? How would that change it?
But would it? Because it hasn't really changed your relationship with your dad.
Well, exactly. And that's what I think is so interesting. Yeah, I think just once you have those relationships, right? Once I know Jess as my sister, and she is a blend of things, by the way, she is my friend, half-sister, and then probably something else, as just in the same way Neil's my bio dad, uncle figure, and God knows what else. Yeah. We can have these really fluid terms for the people in our lives, I think, but I think they can still kind of fall under that family umbrella. And it's a very long way of answering and saying, maybe I don't know. Maybe I don't know.
I like that. You said the donor conception experience is a lifelong journey. It never ends. And I think the same is true for the way in which we define our family lives. We used to think it was, I get married, I have kids, there's my family. But the nuances of how our family relationships change over time, regardless of who's in your family, that's a lifelong journey too, I think. So, Louise, this podcast is amazing. I've listened to it. It's really tremendous. And I highly, highly recommend that anyone who is raising a donor conceived person, is donor conceived, or is curious about the world of donor conception, take a listen. Where can we find all things Louise?
Yes, so the podcast is called You Look Like Me, and it's available wherever people get their podcasts from.
Great. And what about some of your writing? Can we find that?
Yeah, just a small little Google of Louise McLoughlin will bring up a lot of stuff. And then if you peg IVF or donor conceived after that, it's probably going to bring up a lot of my articles. As I said, I've kind of written about my own experience. I've written about other people's experiences as well. So there's, a big wealth of stuff out there.
A lot to dive into, which is great. Thank you so much for joining us. This is so kind of you to spend time with me today. And it was such a great conversation. I loved having you on here today.
No, thank you. I loved it too. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Stork'd with your host, Julia Carroll. This podcast is changing the conversation around the ways people define and create family. If you like what you hear, please support us by sharing with friends and following on Instagram at Stork'd_podcast. We also always appreciate it when you rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For more information, visit storkedpodcast.com to sign up for our newsletter. That's STORKD podcast.com.
I am thrilled to share and extend a free level 2 subscription to the California Cryobank Donor Catalog by using the promo code STORK'd, that's STORKD, at cryobank.com. You will receive free access for 90 days, which is an $145 value.